we're going to open up by talking a little bit about physical activity guidelines because I think this is something that helps embed what we're talking about. Then I just want to clarify that we're not talking about exercise explicitly, mainly because I think exercise is kind of has some baggage for a lot of people. We want to talk about creating opportunities for situated movement. Then we want to think about task-based movement, exactly what that means and why that's important. And then finally, we're just going to talk about different opportunities for creating tasks. So I'm opening up here because I was looking at something the other day. I was looking at some leader training documentation. I noticed that they had the chief medical officer, the CMA's physical activity guide for adults, and this is just a few years old. And they have a couple different ones. They have ones for children. They have ones for young adults, and this is the one they have for adults. And I like this because I think the messaging on this has really improved over the last few years. So what you can see here is they offer a whole bunch of different opportunities. So they have moderate intensity, your cycling, your walking, your active travel, things like that. In the middle, they have build strength, which really kind of reflects in the last few years, we've moved over from this sort of cardio only paradigm to a more holistic strength one. So they have examples would be going to the gym, going out of your way to carry heavy bags, maybe doing some yoga and things like that. And then also sprinkling in some vigorous activities. So, taking some time to go up the stairs, making opportunities to run, to play sport. And then for older adults, also thinking about balance about 2 days a week. So they gave some examples of maybe playing bowls, which is a great community activity, finding opportunities to dance, and then doing activities like Tai Chi as well. And the other thing that I really like about this recent report is they do go out of their way to say that physical activity is just as important, if not more important, for adults who have disabilities. It's one of those things sometimes I think that people who have disabilities or various challenges can feel like physical activity opportunities aren't available to them or perhaps aren't for them. But I think one of the things about the messaging in the last few years has really been focusing on inclusivity, which I think is really important. And also just letting people know that regardless of what disabilities or challenges you might have, that actually engaging in some kind of physical activity is going to be helpful for most people. And that includes, for mental health, for emotional health, and then everything we know already, like whether it's strength, bone density, energy levels, and things like that. So one of the things that I think is always is worth looking at is for people who aren't engaging in physical activity or would like to engage in physical activity, what are the motivators that are really important for them? So there's been a lot of good studies on this. But for older adults, what we found, if we're looking at a sort of a COM-B model of how do we get people motivated to engage in certain behaviors, what's really, really important in terms of enablers are support from family and friends, so some sort of encouragement or sense of companionship. Um, Focusing on the social aspects of physical activity. So really focusing on interaction and social participation and not framing it as some isolating thing where you go to a gym and just use sort of arcane machines for 45 minutes 3 times a week. And then also really emphasizing the personal benefits, especially with older adults, talking about things like independence and fulfillment, letting people know they can still engage in the activities they want to engage in. And then also just letting people know that there are available outdoor facilities and green spaces and showing people how they can interact with them. That's something that's really, really important. A lot of times people don't know about the opportunities to be outside. And I'm sure a lot of people have seen the statistics that at any one time, about 85% of UK adults don't have any kind of gym membership or engaging in any kind of formal exercise in a fitness setting, which isn't to say people aren't moving. It's just to say that a lot of people, when they get their physical activity, it's not going to be in the context of fitness or gyms, which I think makes a lot of sense. A lot of people, they want to be outside, they want to be with their friends, they want to be doing something in the community. And I think there is a perception sometimes that exercise is some additional obligation that they have to do or something that they're supposed to do because their doctor says they have to do it. This is what I mean when I say that exercise can sometimes be a dirty word because whether or not it's fair, I think there is this perception that exercise and probably gyms especially aren't for everybody, and that's okay. There's lots of different ways to move. Um, I want to briefly talk about this idea, this prescriptive emergent continuum, and we've talked about it a lot in other movement labs, so I don't want to belabor it. But it's something I'm going to go back to, so I just want to create a little bit of context, which is that a lot of times when people think about exercise or physical activity, they think about being in the situation where you have a personal trainer, you have some kind of instructor, and they're telling you what you're supposed to be doing. I want you to do bicep curls. I want you to do a leg extension machine. I want you to do this movement just this specific certain way. Um, and that's certainly one way of doing physical activity, but it's not the only way. We've seen this shift, especially in physical education in schools and the chat about physical literacy, this idea that a lot of movement and physical activity can be emergent. So this is really focusing on letting learners solve movement problems, finding solutions that work for them. Um, so instead of saying, look, this is how I want you to do a squat and I want your hips to be at this angle and this your knees to be at this angle, saying, hey, how would you pick this up? If you had something heavy and you need to pick it up and get it from point A to point B, how would you do it? And then you would look at the solutions that people provide, and then you could work with them and give them more opportunities to strengthen their capabilities. This model of learning is really based on um, having some sort of facilitator who presents challenges and opportunities for people to move rather than telling people exactly what you want them to do. So again, instead of this emphasis on sets and reps and increasing, your back squat percentage by 2%, focusing on things like exploration, providing people tasks they can solve, coming up with games or problem-solving opportunities that allow people to come up with their own solutions. And this is really much more in line with the way that people learn to move throughout their entire lives. So if you look at a lot of the recommendations for children, a lot of the modern recommendations, especially for younger kids, is just give people opportunities to move in ways that are playful and interesting for them. And this is really in line with this physical literacy conversation that's been happening the last few years. So there's really been this push to talk about this idea of physical literacy, which is really people's relationship with movement and the physical world around them. And it's treated as this lifelong journey. So rather than just thinking about in terms of sports or are you strong, it's thinking about how do you interact with the world around you, both when you're young, when you're adult, and as you get older. And how do we kind of ensure that people have opportunities to use their bodies in ways that are meaningful for them and to really maximize their options based upon whatever their limitations might be. So this physical literacy model, I think is really useful, and what I like about it is that it's positive, and it really takes everything outside the context of sports or exercise, and is really just about going out into the world. Um, so a lot of what we do at Wild Strong and Nature Moves is really focusing on how we can create these emergent opportunities so people can have fun while they're moving, so they can engage in activities that are meaningful to them rather than giving people a sense that they have to participate in these obligatory, um, you know, I don't know, exercise classes, which for some people is great. I'm someone who actually really enjoys exercise, but not everybody does. So the question is, how can we get people moving outside of this exercise lens? So one of the things that we really focus on is this idea of task-based training. And task-based training can sound complicated, but it doesn't have to. It's literally just thinking about what are the activities that people do in their everyday lives. So sort of thinking about activities of daily living, but really like what are some of the basic tasks that we do on a daily basis? So that might include getting down and getting up. So that could either be getting down to the ground and back up again, or just lowering yourself and getting back up in different situations and positions. Getting there and back, so some form of locomotion. So if you want to get from point A to point B, how do you do it? What if the ground is slippery? What if the ground is uneven? Um, what if you're going over some brambles, you're walking through the woods? Do people have different options for getting around? Then within that, we think about getting over things, getting under things, getting around things, and then also getting out of the way, which can come really handy if you're playing sports and other things. And then we look at reaching, picking up, moving, putting things away, and also throwing and catching. And that's pretty much most of the ways that we're going to interact with the world around us. And what's really useful about that is those are actually really fun ways. If you look at most sports and most games, they're going to involve some combination of those things. And then within that, what you can do is you can start layering in different challenges. So you can think about what kind of distance are we talking about? How much resistance, or are we using heavy objects or light objects? You can start thinking about how confident is the person in doing these different activities, and can we sort of playfully challenge people's confidence a little bit so they can push themselves slightly out of their comfort zone so they can engage in more variety of activities. Then it's always important to think about the environment or the context that people are moving. Are they moving inside on tile? Are they moving outside in the grass? Is it frosty? Is it warm? Is it cold? Is the ground wet? Um, we can also think about complexity or variability. So, we can have really, really simple games, or else we can have games. If you think about football, when people are playing football, there's so much going on. Obviously you've got ball handling skills. You're thinking about what your opponents are doing. You're thinking about what your teammates are doing. You're thinking about all these different variables while you're also dribbling this ball and trying to score. And it's something that you can just say, oh, well, all you're doing is kicking a ball. But actually, if you look at all the different factors involved, football is really complex, as most games are, because they involve so many different decision-making opportunities. And then finally, thinking about creating this sense of speed or urgency or competition, which is just a really nice way to get people just to push themselves a little bit harder than they normally would, but in a fun way, pushing themselves um, for the goal of trying to solve a task or trying to do something that's meaningful for them, rather than just yelling at people and telling them that they need to do more press ups or more burpees or whatever. So, an example of some of the things that we might do in nature moves. Here's an example of an 8 week, I guess, program, an 8 week schedule that we would work with some of our older adults. So usually the first class we'll do has some kind of theme. In this case, it's going to be balance, reaction, and solving movement problems. So really just thinking about what are some fun ways that we can challenge balance. That's not just standing on one foot and counting to see how long you can balance for. But what are all the different ways that we can challenge balance? Whether it's through playing variations of Tai Chi or pushing hands, or whether it is trying to walk along a board, whether it's trying to walk along a board while you're avoiding other people, while you're trying to pick up beanbags, while you're trying to score on the other team. How can you start layering in these challenges that make balance more interesting? Um, then usually for our second class, we'll do something where we focus on picking things up and putting them back down again and finding new ways to move. And again, a lot of games come out of just this idea of getting some kind of object, whether it's a ball or a beanbag, and moving it somewhere else while the other team is trying to score on you. So you can see you've got all these opportunities with that. Then we move on this idea of moving from A to B, how you can get over things, under things, around things, overcoming obstacles. So you can start layering obstacle courses and other challenges. Then thinking about, well, how can we add a little bit of resistance? So what happens if we start carrying heavy things? How does that change the challenges? How does that change how people interact with the world? And then usually after a few weeks, we start to introduce these foam swords, which maybe some people have seen videos of. And when you have the foam swords, all of a sudden you're reaching, you're reacting, you're dodging, you're dueling. And if you've ever seen any of our groups when they're working with these, there's something really magical about just picking up a soft foam stick and imagining it's a sword. It's something that I feel like most people do when they're kids, and actually most adults do. If you put something like that in their hand, they're almost always going to just start playing around with that. Um, then we start thinking about things like balance and carrying objects. So imagine when you were young and you tried serving tea to your parents, maybe for a birthday or Mother's Day or something like that, and how hard it was. Um, and then you try to think about maybe if you ever had a job as a waiter or a restaurant industry, how complicated it can be to try to carry things while you're moving around a busy space, while you're trying not to drop them. So that leads to all kinds of interesting games. And then usually we'll do some sort of module on reaching, catching, throwing, and then obviously that has all this great potential to just add on to other games. So with just a few simple concepts, you kind of see how all of a sudden you can recreate almost any kind of game or any kind of challenge, whether it's floor is lava or whether it's some version of football or maybe ultimate frisbee or games of tag. There are all these sorts of things that you can do. And all these activities are going to be accessible to a lot of people, to most people, if you just think about how you can ensure that they're inclusive and how you can improvise on the rules to make sure that people can participate in these activities in ways that are meaningful for them. So I just wanted to show some examples of things that you can do with older adults that don't require you to be in a gym and don't require specialized equipment. So if you just have a tennis ball, you can think about with the tennis ball, obviously you can just throw things back and forth. You can do some sort of game where people are trying to catch a ball and then step further back as they do it. Then you can add an element of what's called dual tasking. So you can have them try to catch a ball while also kicking a ball back and forth. So that kind of adds some additional, I guess you could call it a cognitive challenge. You can do all sorts of activities in the next picture. You can see that we have this is an activity that we call magic tiles, where maybe you've done this in school. It's like a floor is lava variation where people try to get from point A to point B without touching the grass, but you turn it into an interesting collaborative activity. And then all kinds of obstacle course stuff. You can see here people practicing getting over trees. I was talking about balance earlier. So, the sort of classic balance test is standing on one leg um, and seeing how long you can do it for. That's sort of the clinical version. But what happens if you are trying to balance on a board? What happens is as you're doing that, your partner is moving some sticks around and you need to try to dodge the sticks and step over them, get around them. Think of all the different textured ways that that can challenge balance in a way that you might not be able to do in a more clinical or staid situation. And then just funny little things like just trying to um, grab a stick if someone's holding it out of the way, and think about what different kinds of positions you can elicit. You can go high, you can go low, you can go close, you can go far, and all these different movements. And then in the last one, we have a few 7-year-olds who are playing a game called tail tag, where you have a towel slipped into your back, and the other person tries to grab it while you try to grab theirs. And it's amazing how much different kind of movement comes out of that. Um, just a few more. One of the things when we were talking about this idea of emergent problem solving, you can take someone in a gym and you can say, hey, look, this is how you're supposed to lift a barbell. This is how you're supposed to lift a heavy object. But I think that what we find in real life is that when we're interacting with the world around us, things aren't always so clear cut. If we're picking up some potting soil or if we need to move some dog food, it's not always going to be in a situation or position that necessarily mimics what we see at the gym. And it's also not always going to be as meaningful. But if you give people opportunities to try picking up different things and creating games and challenges out of it, you'll find that people are very, very good at self-organizing and finding movements and positions that work for them despite what some of their limitations might be. So just a few more pictures. You can see the waiter games. You can see some obstacle course stuff. You can see a game here where you try to get your partner to keep contact with your hand while you move around in different directions and they support themselves. And again, something like this is much more fun and interesting than telling someone they have to hold a plank for a minute um, because it ties into all kinds of other games. So because this is supposed to be about game design, Um, I wanna share some principles about game design. Some of the things that we found actually make games fun. So here I've got a picture of Sean Longhurst, who I talked to a few months ago, and he's someone who I think has really put in a lot of time thinking about what makes games fun. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna talk about what makes games fun, and then we're gonna go ahead and try to give some examples of how we can plan different sessions to make them interesting and fun for participants. So one of the first rules I think on game design, or Sean thinks on game design, is that they should be simple to play. So when you're coming up with a game, you want the game to immediately make sense, have really clear task and goal. So something like, um, get that ball in the bucket. You really want to think, could the base concept be explained in 10 seconds? And all really good games involve something like that. You think about tag or tig, it's like, can you touch someone without them touching you? You know, or if you think about football, can you get this ball and bring it over into the opponent's zone, into their goal? So first, you want it to be simple to play. You don't want to have all these variables that aren't necessarily just think, okay. Is this game simple? Does it make sense? And that's one of the reasons why task-based design is so good because it's very easy to say, I want you to get from point A to point B. The floor is lava. Don't fall in the lava. And then all these really interesting situations emerge out of that. Number two, you want the games to be immersive. You want people to feel like they're present in the moment. So again, we don't want things to feel obligatory. We want people to want to be there. So not watching the clock, not worrying about chores, not thinking about what they have to do next, but thinking, this is where I want to be right now. So can you create games that have enough sense of friendly competition, problem solving, and other forms of immersive design that make people want to be there? Number three, is there an opportunity to build trust or camaraderie? And this is really important because we know how vital social connection is, for everybody at all ages. But especially if you want people to keep on engaging in activity, there has to be some sense of social engagement and camaraderie. So when you're designing your sessions and your games, you want to think, are we presenting opportunities to face challenges together and to overcome challenges? You want to present opportunities for people to help and be helped. Different people are going to be good at different things. And, this idea of reciprocity, I think, is really important, especially for building communities, is that people want to be helped, but they also want to feel useful. So if you can create opportunities where people can feel like they're useful and they contributed to the group, that's really, really going to help with everything we were just talking about. So you want to give people opportunities to step up and also give opportunities for people to lean on people when needed. You want games to be accessible. So you always want to have multiple entry points to a game. So that sort of means regardless of people's capabilities or limitations or perceived capabilities or limitations, you want to make sure everyone feels like they can participate. Um, you want them to be flexible with multiple ways to succeed, so not just always favoring one kind of skill set or one kind of ability. You really want to feel that anyone at any age, any level of confidence, physical, mental ability can engage in a way that works for them. So a good question to ask yourself is, if I were four, how could I play this game? How could I engage with this game? What about if I were 84? What if I were 94? How could I participate in this game? And what modifications would you have to make as a facilitator in order to make this accessible? Number five is a sense of delight. So, does it put a smile on your face? Is there this kind of element of serendipity? And what we mean by that is, do interesting, fun situations emerge that you don't expect? Is there an element of surprise? Does it evoke childhood memories and joy and thinking about play? And you'll see this when you're running an activity and it clicks, you'll just see that people start spontaneously laughing. You'll just look around, you'll see everyone has a smile on their face and everyone's having a really good time and they're not thinking about being self-conscious. They're not thinking about, whatever it is they're normally worried about, and they're just there having a great time. And then there's a bonus principle, which is this idea of Play-Doh. Um, and it's this idea of flexibility and playing around with the games and molding them to your own. So each game that you can design, or each game that you read about, each game you see on the internet, each game that someone shows you, it's a starting point for you to mold however you like. So you can focus on what's fun for everybody in your group, what's fun for you. Also, it's okay to be loose on the rules or timing. It's one of the contradictory things that often what makes games fun are the constraints or the rules or the limitations, but also having that little bit of wiggle room. So, a lot of times when we're playing with people in their 60s or their 70s or their 80s, a lot of times people will cheat a little bit, and that's okay, as long as everyone's still having a good time. If someone comes up with a creative way to win the game or give themselves an advantage, let them play around with it. It's not the Olympics. So definitely like leave some wiggle room for people to explore and have fun within the constraints of the game. We always like to say you want enough rules for clear goals and fairness, but enough flexibility to kind of keep the flow. And also it kind of allows opportunities for people with different abilities to engage in different ways. So when we plan task-based games, this is something that we use. It's this idea of ECOGI, which is just an acronym. It's the best I could come up with. Um, and it's kind of how we plan a session. So when we plan a session, what the first thing we want to think about is what kind of task do we want people to express, or what kind of movements do we want to elicit? So you always kind of start off with like, well, what is it we want people to do today? Do we want them to work on balance? Do we want them to work on problem solving, on teamwork? Um, And then what we do is we think about, all right, well, what is a simple way for us to start challenging this? And then what you do is you start layering in complexity or challenges. So I'll talk about this in a second, but you start to open up the activity a little bit and allow different ways of interpretation, some dynamism. We'll usually finish with some kind of group game, which can get sort of chaotic, but in a good way. Um, and then the thing we're thinking about the whole time is, are there any iterations we need to make this more inclusive? What's working, what's not working, who's participating, who's not participating? How can we quickly change the parameters of the game or the activity to make sure that people are having a good time? So um, this is this is one I'm actually going to open up right now. So people can take themselves off mute. And I'm just going to start off at the very beginning. So if I was thinking, pick a task or skill you want to challenge. How can we elicit that via task design? So that sounds like a big question, but it doesn't have to be. All right. So I'm just going to open it up to the group. What are some different things if you're working with a group of people, say a group of older adults, and we sort of know what it is that are beneficial for people in terms of physical activity. But what's a task or a skill that we could challenge? So I'm opening it up. Anyone have a task or skill or challenge that you want to talk about? Let's check the chat.
We can do an example of what we might normally do, Andrew.
Yeah. So what would that be?
Mm, I was thinking just about the balancing yourself and an object
Yeah,
game that we're playing
sure.
with this week.
Let me turn my video back on. Hang on. Do you guys see me at all? Can you see me?
Yes,
Still
there's a
no?
float, yeah, there's a floaty head.
What? I've got a floaty head. Wow. Okay, cool. Okay, that's good. I can't see myself, but I'm glad you can. Am I here? No, still no. Okay. Um, so yeah, all right. So one of the things we might do is we might work on balance. And if we're starting off with this idea, we want to elicit balance. Well, what is balance? Well, in this case, we'll say, the most basic definition of balance is essentially not falling over, especially if you experience some other kind of perturbation, like is there something else that's going to knock you off balance? So probably the most basic way that you might start with, or you might see in a doctor's office, is just having people stand on one leg. So you could definitely have people just play around first with standing on one leg. But then you want to think about, well, like, could that be challenging for people? So if even that is challenging for people, what is a way that we can improvise or do some kind of iteration so that people can play around with their balance a little bit, but still get that challenge? Um, so it could be something as simple as just making sure people have like a broomstick handy, and they don't need to hold on to it really tightly. But what if you had a light broomstick handy? You tried standing on one leg, and then if you lose your balance, you can just hold on to the broomstick a little bit more. That sounds very simple, and it is simple. Okay, that's an example of a closed activity where people can start playing with their balance. So this might be something that is good. You can work it into warm up or something like that, or you could do an early partner activity. All right, there we go. Um, And then what you can do is you can start opening up. When we say opening up, what we mean is introducing more variables. So what about if you're trying to balance when someone else is throwing a ball to you and you're trying to catch it? Or what if you're trying to balance along a board, you're trying to get to A to B, but there's someone else on the other side of the board who's trying to go in the opposite direction. How does that add an additional challenge? And this is what we want to start layering in to make it actually feel meaningful and situated in the real world. And then from there, we can think about how we start adding in extra variables. So the process is pick a task or skill you want to challenge. All right. Um, how can we elicit that via task design? Then you want to think about fun and energetic ways to express our tasks. What would a fun group game look like? Then we work backwards. So I'll give you an example. One of the games we do a lot is we call it Dragon Egg Snatchers. And Dragon Egg Snatchers is a form of Floor is Lava. So it's a Floor is Lava game, okay? And what you do is first you get the group to design a simple obstacle course with some boards. And then what they do is they practice walking around on the boards in a low stress situation. And then what you do after that is you create a game where you have people on one side and people on the other, and they're trying to go across these boards while they're trying to pick up some bean bags and bring the bean bags back to their home base for a score. Now, what's really nice about that is it's competitive. There's there's some teamwork, there's some problem solving. Because it's competitive, it ends up being quite energetic. You have the sense of urgency, so people will challenge themselves a little bit more than if you just told them to walk on a balance beam from A to B. All right. The only issue with that is if you start off a class with this big energetic group game, it's going to be a little bit too much for people. They're not going to have a chance to build up their confidence and to practice the movements. So then what you want to do is you want to go back and you want to find what is the most basic expression of this task. So again, it could be standing on one foot. It could be balancing on a beam and walking from A to B. So you want to start off with something where you're really reducing the complexity, that chaos, that stress. Then all right, we want to think about how can we start introducing some situatedness or representativeness. Now, those are both kind of big, clunky words that just mean how can you make things more realistic? And how do you make things more realistic? Well, you add real life variables. So in this case, it could just be if you got a partner, how could you and the partner interact? So instead of just standing on one leg and not reacting to anything, how could you react to other things around you, like trying to catch a ball, trying to move out of the way of a stick, for example? Then, okay, once people kind of get used to this sort of dynamic way of moving, the next question you want to ask is how can we introduce some fun, some energy, some urgency? And then this is when you start adding in either an element of friendly competition or a kind of problem solving where maybe you have like a time limit or something so people feel like they have to move just a little bit quicker, um, which, for some people can feel, a little bit stressful. But if you do it in a nice way, that's where the element of gameplay comes from, where you actually feel like, oh, I better do this quickly. And that's when people have to start thinking on their feet and really thinking about how they would solve this problem. And then finally, we think about how we can increase this variability and challenge via group games or activities. And this is where we kind of go for the final big moving group games you might have seen in some of our videos. And while all this is happening in the background, you're always thinking about this idea of how can we iterate to maximize inclusivity for everybody. So you always want to be observing the activities and thinking, are people having fun? Is everyone participating? How can we adjust the tasks to make them more interesting? And then you also want to think about what can we do better next time. So this is just as a facilitator, kind of standing off the side, just thinking about is this working for everybody? So this comes into this idea of adapting games and activities. So a lot of you may have seen these before, and they're easily available on the internet. You'll have the slides at the end so you can see. First example of an adaptation tool is what's called the step tool. And this is just this idea of how you can change space, task, equipment, and people in order to make activities more inclusive. So space could be just changing the space that the activity is taking place. Usually that means making a space larger or smaller, which can make the activity more or less challenging. You can also change the shape. Sometimes you can change the surface and where you're doing it. So for example, doing balance activities over grass, soft grass will feel much more inclusive for a lot of people than doing them on concrete. You can think about how you want to change the task, changing the type of activity that's taking place. Do you want to change the rules, the roles? How do people score? Changing the equipment, making things bigger or smaller, making balls heavier or lighter. Um, if we're doing balance stuff, you can make the boards a little bit more narrow or a little bit wider. And then finally thinking about the people. So you can change the teams. If one team feels like they're always winning, you could give them an extra player. You can change the ratio of taggers or defenders, offense, depending on the structure of the game. But just always thinking about moving and changing things so that they're inclusive and fun for everybody. A very similar tool is called TREE, and that stands for Teaching, Rules, Equipment, Environment. So changing your teaching style or how you present something, changing the rules of an activity, changing the equipment, and then changing the environment. And then the last one, which is probably the most involved, I think this is an Australian model. It's called Change It. And it's the same thing. Just always be thinking about how you can change your facilitation or coaching style. Always think about how you can change the rules for how you score, win, or define a victory or decide how you're going to solve the problem. Changing the area, changing the numbers. This can be the ratios of teams. Thinking about game rules. How are they interesting? How can you change them to make them more interesting? Changing equipment. Thinking about inclusion, and then changing time. So you can just adding a time element will always make things more interesting, but you can increase or decrease the time. And then another one I really like is from an organization called Boeing, and they have the Challenger Change card. And they think it's a very similar thing. It's just thinking about how you can change the variables of the activity to make sure everyone's having a good time. I guess the last thing I would talk about with all these is also thinking about introducing superpowers. So if you have someone in a group who, for example, isn't as confident in their balance, can you give them a superpower that allows them to participate? So maybe saying like you're allowed to step in the lava for 5 seconds, or saying you're allowed to catch and other people aren't allowed to catch. So all of a sudden that person can really engage and contribute to the team. In terms of additional resources, there's loads of good stuff on Play. So there's loads of different manuals out there. This will all be included in the final presentation when we share it with everyone. So this is just to get you thinking about different ideas on how you can incorporate Play and some manuals for how people do it. All right, cool. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the share. Here I am. And I just kind of want to open this up so that people could have a chat about their own experiences of incorporating play or some questions they might have, or just kind of situations for whether or not it's appropriate to incorporate play into physical activity. So I don't know if there are any questions that came up, Amelia, in the chat. You can put your questions in the chat if you want to, or or else we can just have a little conversation about it.
Less so questions, and more. So Bex came up with just some kind of useful tasks that are kind of relevant.
Oh, cool.
So things like gardening and putting the bins out, picking up dog poo, which is something that we kind of talk about quite a lot when.
Yeah, it's funny how often dog hey Bex, thanks for jumping in. Yeah, so gardening and putting the bins out and actually picking up the dog poo. That's funny because we do have games based around all of them. Putting the bins out is a huge one, and one of the first I think one of the first or second lessons that we normally do when we're doing carrying objects is doing these situational challenges. So it's exactly like that. So imagine you're moving something, like you have like a bag or a box or something like that. How would you carry it? And most people might carry it like this. But then imagine that it's an old recycling bin that was left over from a party last week that it's the middle of July and you don't want to touch you. How would you change that? Same thing with picking things up. You know, if the way you pick up something that you kind of want to touch and hold is going to be very, very different. So what if you were trying to pick up something with a grabber claw? Or what if you were trying to use like a pole or a stick to try to fish some things out that are far away? So things like that are really great examples. And that's exactly what you do. All you do is you just start thinking about real life activities, real life challenges that you have. And then you think about, man, there's a lot in here. Like, taking out the bins is something that can seem really simple, but if you think about all the activities, first you sort them. So that's an opportunity for dual tasking. So you could do some kind of activity where you have some boxes, you can pretend they're bins, and people have to sort them by color. So you could have two teams that, for example, are trying to sort them by color, and then they have to pick up the boxes and move them from A to B. And already you see how that could be a fun game. Um, for all different kinds of people. It doesn't need to be something like you're a pirate and you're being attacked by sharks. It could just literally be it's bin day. You've looked down the street, you've forgotten it's bin day, and you've realized that the bin lorry is coming, and you only have 1 minute to sort out all your recycling and get it to the end of your driveway. Bam, that's a game. Um, Gardening is another great one because with gardening, you're always finding yourself in different positions. You can imagine that if someone were weeding, and you could think of the same thing if you had different colored bean bags. Maybe all the red bean bags are weeds, and the green ones are the plants you want to protect. Could you come up with some kind of game where someone is down on the ground, maybe in a quadruped position or some kind of ground lying position, where they have to move around and sort things? um, you know, while they're doing it in competition with someone else who has a similar task? Or, could you imagine that someone has a garden and you're trying to put the weeds in their garden for some reason and trying to take them out? But you see how if you just think about the movements that are involved in these everyday activities, it's very, very easy to make them interesting or engaging. So, yeah, I think that Bex has some good examples there.
There were a couple of questions that came in by email from people that couldn't make it. One was just thinking about ideas for walk leaders. So sorry, I can't read the net. Becky runs a sorry, okay. Becky runs a weekly walk for a small group, but they're quite cautious movers. And she's been thinking about sort of creative ways to get in a few different movements outside of just walking. But I guess actually quite a few of the examples that came up would probably be useful, but I wonder if there's a bit more we could go into for kind of ideas for walk leaders.
Yeah, I think it's funny because I was thinking about the walk leaders the other day, and when I pulled up that first slide on CMA recommendations for physical activity, it's one of the things that a lot of walk leaders will talk about in their training, that walking is great and it's really useful. Um, and if you can get people to come out and walk, it can tick so many boxes in terms of socialization, in terms of access to green space and things like that. But once people start walking for a few weeks, especially if they don't feel overly challenged in that regard, um, it doesn't really give a lot of opportunities for all those other physical benefits that we have. So, whether it's strength or flexibility or mobility or whatever. So, I mean, w with walking, I mean, one of the things that you can always think of is just some kind of standard floor is lava. And we talk a lot about this idea of desire paths, and it just means that people come up with the same games over and over and over again. So you can just kind of look at like what are the games that kids come up with when they have some time themselves and they have some space. And chances are that if it's fun for kids, it's gonna be fun for adults and older adults. And one of the ones that almost every kind of culture has is some variation of floor is lava. So it could be that there's piranhas or sharks in there, floor is lava, it's electrified, whatever. But I think that's always a really, really nice challenge that you can incorporate. So if I'm doing a walk sometimes, I'll just look at opportunities where maybe there's some stones that are arranged in an interesting pattern, or maybe there's patches of grass, something like that. And then you can kind of say, hey, I want you to imagine for the next part that actually the floor is lava. Can we get over here? And it doesn't have to be challenging. A lot of walk groups, people will bring over, either Nordic walking poles or carbon fiber poles or things like that. So if people want something to help them with the balance, also if people are comfortable, you can always get people to hold hands or help other people with balance. But that's a great way to invite people into it. One of the ones we do a lot with our groups, especially during different seasons, is we'll just have people imagine that they're trying to pick flowers. You don't actually have to have them pick flowers, but as a nice warm-up activity, if you say, if you're walking by and you see something interesting, I don't really want you to pick it up. I just want you to imagine that you're picking it up from wherever you are. So if you see something, just try to reach for it. So that means instead of people just walking, all of a sudden, people are reaching for things like that. And it doesn't seem like a big thing, but actually, just that act of reaching and stretching from different positions can be a really nice sort of introductory warm up. So I think that's a really good one. The other thing is depending on the environment, um, if people are in partners, you can just have them sort of come up with little challenges. So, get people grouped up of similar abilities and just say, as you're walking, just kind of come up with a little challenge. And, if it's, two people who are roughly the same physical ability in their 80s, it just might be like, hey, can you reach this branch right here? So you just kind of come by, person A reaches for the branch, then person B reaches for the branch, can you go ahead and can you touch that tree stump right there? So getting down and touching the tree stump. And that's not a complicated game, but because it's interactive and because there is that element of sort of, I would say, playful competition of trying to match what your partner's doing, then all of a sudden it opens up all these other opportunities for movement that you wouldn't get if you were just walking.
Good comment from Bex. Is it significant to mention if people are cautious about walking or starting to avoid activities? It's important to rationalize how or whether challenging balance is appropriate.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point too. You don't want to start layering on challenges in all contexts right away because we need to be mindful of where people are coming from and also thinking about where people were before they made the decision to engage with an activity. So, sometimes people will talk about the transactional theory of participation, or sometimes people will talk about icebergs and things like that. But by the time you see someone who's shown up in your walking group or shown up in your outdoor physical activity group, they've kind of had to go through so many decisions to get themselves there. First, they have to maybe they talk to their GP or they talk to a friend who brings it to their attention, and then maybe they'll go to the website or they'll look at the brochure. Then they'll think about, well, how do I get there? So they're going to arrange some form of transportation. Either they drive or they need to figure out a bus and they need to figure out a carpool. and they have all these sort of potential barriers along the way. And if they show up to a walking group and all of a sudden, you're having people do all these challenges right away, that can feel really hard, you know. So you always want to make sure that things are done in such a way that it feels, um, that it's accessible to people and people feel like they can participate in a way that's not overly onerous. Um, and what I've found with leading different groups is that different groups will kind of sort of come up with their own culture. You know, and what I mean is even when I've taught or I've led groups that are identical on paper, I found that like the Wednesday group tends to have, its own sort of culture, and maybe like the Friday group has a different culture. And that makes it much easier for people as they come in because they can kind of be invited into that and they have a sense of what the vibes are. So if, for example, your Wednesday group ends up being challenged, a little bit more, they can kind of normalize that. And I think it's also important if it is a group of peers, and this is one of the things that I think is nice about doing sort of peer-led, less coach-led, um, I don't know, sessions, is that if people see people who look like them engaging in things, it'll make it feel much more possible. You know, this idea of the adjacent possible. Um, so I don't think that should be overstated. There's a big difference between walking into a dance class where you have someone 20 years younger than you doing these dance steps saying, I want you to do it, versus, seeing some people who seem to have similar capabilities who are trying it. But I mean, to your point, Bex, yeah, you want to make sure that like, the first thing is people feel included. You don't want to scare them away. And then you just kind of want to think about, well, how can we start slowly introducing the least intimidating version of this so that we can kind of invite people to engage in these activities rather than making it feel like it's something they have to do. Yeah.
Has anyone got any more questions before we head? Okay. So Andrew, I think on the last slide you've got your email. But thank you very much for coming today, everybody. We'll send out the recording. Oh, what if the outdoors puts people off? Good question.
Um, yeah, I mean that's an interesting one because not everyone is going to be into the outdoors. Now, the numbers sort of show that most people see being outdoors as an advantage. So for a lot of people, they do want to be outdoors. Now, obviously that changes with people's sense of confidence and capabilities and things like that. So for some people, especially they spend a lot of time outside, we saw this a lot during COVID, that actually being outdoors suddenly became quite intimidating for people. Actually, we had a really good conversation with William Bird about this in the podcast a few weeks ago because he talks about this as how can you kind of make people feel like how can you allow people to feel comfortable outdoors? That's a good one to check off. Yeah. Thanks, Bex. Yeah, I'm the same way. I wouldn't be able to do a Zumba class. And that kind of brings me to my second point, which is you can't be everything to everybody, you know? And that's the thing. It's like, if you're a Zumba class, it's baked in, you can't really be a Zumba instructor if you don't like dancing, don't want other people to dance. I think that there are lots of offerings in the area, and for me, it's really important that I deliver things outside. Now, for all the gameplay and all the challenges and everything like that, all that could be done inside. If you think about how people run a lot of PE classes, most PE classes are done in indoor gyms and they have all kinds of really simple tools, whether it's just, softballs or hula hoops or, those little circular dots that they use for marking stations, and all those things are great. But what I really like about being outside and, using branches and sticks and twigs and things like that is it provides everything for you. So it really takes the pressure off the instructor. But yeah, I mean, you have to match to what people's needs are. So, for me, it is horses for courses, and I need to be honest about what it is that I'm interested in offering. But then at the same time, I don't think there's anything wrong with meeting people where they are. You just have to think about what additional challenges that's going to add, because trying to run some of these things in a village hall is going to be much harder. Ooh, I like that. That's a very good suggestion from Bex. Getting ready for the outdoors could be a theme. Um, if outdoors is a concern. Actually, that man, Bex, you should be doing this. We'll get you on to do the next one. That's one of the things that I think is really important to think about as well, is this idea of using this as an opportunity to get people ready for different things. So we had a theme a few months ago, which was just travel, which was a lot of people in our group, they were getting ready to travel for the summer, and some of them were quite worried. They were traveling with their families or they hadn't traveled in a while. So what we did is we did a big mind map of all the different activities that you might be worried about in travel. Is it moving your suitcase? Is it getting to your train on time? For some people, maybe it's getting up into the train if they're worried about the step up and the gap up there. So how can you kind of work around that? So the idea was kind of getting ready to travel, and we did a few weeks where we kind of played around these different things and made some games and activities that were based on the tasks we wanted to elicit. And it helped people build up their confidence. As another thing, sometimes there's a lot of funding, especially in Scotland, for active travel right now, which is great, but not everyone's ready for active travel. This assumption that everyone should be getting around by bicycle. Um, oh yeah, that's a good one. Yeah, people with the buses that pull away. So that's a really big issue for people when they're going out and trying to engage in any kind of travel is what if the bus comes and I don't feel confident I can get there on time? So that's one that you can help people with. But yeah, with active travel like bicycles and things like that, not everyone's gonna be ready for a bicycle. Um, but you can get people ready. And in some ways, some of the games and stuff we were talking about, no, please keep on contributing back 'cause I really like what you're saying. Um, this idea of creating these games that can help people build up their confidence in different ways. So maybe, Andy, as to your question, um, which is, well, what if people are intimidated about going outside? Is it possible to do a hybrid? Is it possible to do something a little bit inside and kind of do it? This would be an example of a closed activity. And then one of the variabilities, one of the variations that you add as you increase complexity and texture in the activity, could it be doing the same thing outside? So if you're with a group who really lack a lot of confidence when it comes to moving, could you have them do some activities, on the floor um, of the village hall? And then what would happen if they try to do the same activities out on the lawn? How does that change things? That right there is a great idea because you've built up confidence in one, so you have that closed activity, and then kind of going with that Ikogi model as you open it up and you add other factors, just being outside in nature could be that factor, which then could be the step that gets people ready to join the walking group or gets people to start participating in other activities. Because that's what we're trying to do, is we're trying to build up people's confidence and their sense of capability so they can engage in more activities. And play is just a really good way to do that because it gets people comfortable and it gets it so they're not so worried about thinking about all the things they're nervous about. It just gets them focusing on doing the task itself. So yeah, that's a good question. It led to some good answers.
I've lost access to the chat somehow.
Says if we could all support maintenance of getting up floor skills, avoidance of long lies
Yeah.
in later years could be reduced. Uh, yeah, so I think that that's one of the best things that we can do in these kinds of activities is helping people rebuild confidence and getting down to the floor because it's one of those opportunities. We talk a lot about affordances. A lot of physical activity and exercise outlets, thinking about something like chair yoga, which is great for a certain set of population, but I think perhaps is a missed opportunity for others or thinking about going to a gym and things like that. A lot of these activities are done seated or also just sort of done on padded floors where you're walking around, everything's very even. I think just introducing the opportunity to engage with the floor a little bit and kind of coming up with activities that allow people, if not getting down all the way down to the floor, perhaps grading it. So, for example, if people aren't comfortable getting down to the floor, can they get down to a log or can they use some of the environment around them to help them get up and down before you start adding challenges? But I know that in the summer, we've had a nice dry summer here. So we did a lot of activities with our groups on getting down to the ground and even just rolling around and moving and reaching for things from the ground and trying to get back up again. And there's so many fun games you could do with that. And once people stop being intimidated by the idea of getting up and down from the ground, and you give people, I think this is really important, you give people the opportunity to find movement solutions that work for them. So we've worked with so many people who at the beginning say, well, I can't get down from the ground or I can't get down to the ground. But what they sort of mean is that the way they get down to the ground isn't the way other people get down to the ground. But if you give them opportunity to talk to their peers and kind of throw around some ideas, you might realize like, well, they can't get down to the ground the way they used to because their knees hurt or because their wrist hurts, but actually they found a solution that allows them to get down to the ground. Maybe it involves, putting their hands on a tree trunk. Maybe it involves getting some help from someone else. Maybe it involves having a stick. Maybe it involves a process that takes about a minute or two. But once you can get people down to the ground, if you can do activities there, I think that's one of the best ways that you can really increase people's confidence, because so much of what we talk about in the fear of falling cycle and fear avoidance cycles often comes from people just not having the opportunity and the space to play around with getting down to the ground and getting back up again. And I think that if you can give that space for people, I think that can be really transformative.
All right, I am going to stop you there.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, thank you very much, and thanks for all the conversations, guys. We'll follow up by email with the recording and with any other links that we think would be useful. There's a few podcast episodes that touch on quite a lot of this, and some of our previous movement labs, which kind of touch on the prescriptive emergent continuum. And was there anything else I was going to add? Next month we'll be back, and it will be a guest webinar, and it will be on trauma-informed movement coaching, so working with vulnerable populations. Okay, thank you very much, guys.